time to move on to the panel session. Panel session is on standards, regulation, and vulnerability disclosures. As you've heard, a lot is happening in this space, and we have a panel of, I think, people who will have a lot of views and experience on these matters. We have 5 people on the panel, including myself. I'll go through and introduce everyone. First off, we have Jen Ellis, who is Vice President of Community and Public Affairs at Rapid7, where she focuses on advancing cybersecurity by building collaboration between the security community and those outside it, which I think is clearly very needed. This has come up as an issue that the broader environment is really important. Jen is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, sits on boards of the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. I am the Cavalry and the Aerospace Village. She's a member of the Board of Advisors to the Cyber Peace Institute and the Global Cyber Alliance. She's testified before US Congress and spoken at numerous security and business conferences. So welcome to Jen. Next off, David Rogers is a mobile phone and IoT security specialist who runs Copperhorse, which is a software and security company based in Windsor in the UK. His company is currently focusing on product security for the Internet of Things, as well as future automotive security. David chairs the Fraud and Security Group at the GSMA, sits on the executive board of the IoT Security Foundation, and he authored the UK's Code of Practice for consumer IoT security in collaboration with the UK government and industry colleagues. He's a member of the UK's Telecom Supply Chain Diversification Advisory Council, and he was awarded the MBE for services to cybersecurity in the Queen's Birthday Honours in 2019. So another well-versed person. Next, I'd like to welcome Laurie Mercer, who's a security consultant at HackerOne, which is claimed to be the world's most popular vulnerability disclosure platform. Laurie's primary focus is on vulnerability disclosure best practice, operations, and policy. He has a strong technical background, has worked with customers such as the UK government and Asian technology firms. And last, but by no means least, James Skuse is the GSMA Security Services Managers. He's a CREST-registered threat intelligence analyst with a background in security analysis, including significant work with the academic research community. At the GSMA, James is responsible for a variety of security services, including what I think to this audience is probably the most interesting thing, is GSMA's across the mobile industry CVT program, which focuses on disclosures which are not vendor or operator specific. So I'll start off with a little bit about myself and then move on to our first question. I'm Roger Shepherd. I spent 30 years in the semiconductor industry and then set up a Chipless, my consultancy. Back in 2015, I saw David Rogers, amongst others, present at the Internet of Things Security Summit, an event which led to the formation of the IoT Security Foundation, of which Chipless was a founder member. And at that time, I think some of us might have thought that we could make very rapid progress to securing the Internet of Things with some fairly simple steps. However, it's now clear that the IoT exists in a much more complex landscape in terms of the technologies, the ownership, the multiple organizations who are part of it, than we've maybe appreciated. And that those complexities create a range of non-technical problems. And that's where I'd like to start with the panel. What are the non-technical complexities of the IoT which lead to difficulties in the deployment of standards, the introduction of regulations, and the adoption of vulnerability disclosure? And I'd like to start with Jen on that one. Jen.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Thank you for including me, and thank you for the intro, Roger. So yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said complexity, right? That is really the issue here, is that in every dimension there is complexity. We are dealing with technology that, as Kat highlighted in her session just before this one, it's not even one thing. It's a device plus an app. There's all sorts of different sort of aspects of it, and the technology is often compiled as much as it's developed, and so you're dealing then with the complexity of who owns responsibility for all of the pieces that go into it. Then you've got the fact that in IoT, you're often dealing with white labeling of technology or no labeling of technology. So again, it's unclear who owns responsibility for it. You've then got the fact that we're dealing with a global marketplace. So you've got cultural differences in norms, things like areas where in the marketplace it's really unusual to respond to vulnerability disclosure, and they don't have good practices on that. You've got differences in legislative, regulatory, or standards approaches. Again, Kat talked a lot about what's happening in the US, and she mentioned a lot of concern around international alignment, right? And we are seeing an effort in Europe, in the UK, in Australia, the US, like we're seeing lots of effort to come in line, but there are also countries that aren't part of that process and are in a totally different category in how they think about this and the standards of behavior that they're sort of setting for their own marketplaces, if they're setting any at all. Then you've got issues around how it's being used. So frequently we see a lack of clear ownership. We see a lack of clear management strategy. Often you'll be in an environment where the people that are driving adoption of the technology are completely separate from the people who are tasked with rolling it out and managing it and securing it. And frequently those two people don't have a huge amount of like simpatico between them. Often the tech people don't have a lot of political capital inside the organization. You see this a lot in sort of environments like healthcare, clinical environments, where technologies are being adopted and perhaps not, the people adopting them don't have a good understanding of what it really means to manage and maintain them. And we're seeing that increasingly in things like smart cities rollouts and that kind of stuff, where, the sort of poor local government tech people who are already completely overburdened have no ability to go back to a council member and go, no, we can't use this technology. It's sort of all guns blazing. So there's a real sort of lack of sort of ownership and process there. And then on a consumer level, we see that DCMS ran a survey a couple of years ago and found that consumers basically have an assumption that if a product is available in the shop, that it's secure, whatever that means. And so like we've got a major mismatch of expectation. My guess is, going back to my previous example of organizations where people adopt and drive, if they're not rooted in security themselves, they probably also have that same expectation of, if it's available in the market, it must be secure. And then also there's the fact that people haven't made the shift mentally yet to thinking about the fact that these are computers. So they still think of them as, washing machines and fridges, rather than this is a computer in my kitchen and this is a computer in my kitchen and this is a computer in my kitchen. So there's just a sort of real mismatch in terms of understanding and expectation. There's this like huge divide between, I think, what the security community is looking at and thinking about and what everybody else is thinking about. And unfortunately, it's the everybody else that are the adopters, right? Like that's the whole thing about the Internet of Things, is anyone can buy, anyone can use, and everyone is. And so we're seeing the attack surface just scale super rapidly. And I will leave you on that doom and gloom note. Dun, dun, dun.
That was quite broad ranging. Do any of the other panelists have anything they'd like to add to Jen's scene setting? David?
To my scary story.
Well, I mean, Jen's covered a lot of ground there, and she's exactly right. I think what in my experience, and this also goes back to the sort of expectations around mobile phones as well, sort of had this experience maybe 10, 15 years ago, is that the consumer expectation is that it's secure. and I think it's reasonable for them to expect that the retailer has done some level of due diligence, and the same with I don't think, as you can see from the code of practice, I don't think there's been enough focus on the manufacturers, and they've managed to get away with a hell of a lot up until now. And so that's really why a lot of people are saying enough is enough, and that pressure actually from consumers who have been able to see the real effects of that with the baby cam breaches and so on. It's the tipping point where people say, do you know what? I don't want any of the stuff behind me. And that is also bad, right? I'm a technologist and I want to see innovation, but I want to see it in a sensible way. I think it's easily possible to create a quite innovative connected teddy bear, for example, that isn't exploitative and isn't insecure. It's not so much to ask. And I think that's a reasonable expectation from consumers.
Okay, thanks, David. Laurie, did you have anything on the general scene setting to add?
I was just going to add that, because of course people talk to me once they've already decided that they want to implement a VDP, because we're a VDP platform. And even then it's not so simple, because some bright sparks come up with the idea saying let's do this, it's a great thing to do, we should do this, we've mandated, or we choose to do this.
Right. Can I just interrupt you, because the CVD was the next topic that I wanted to go on to. So we will cover that, I hope, in a bit more depth next.
Absolutely.
If that's okay. James, did we cover everything that you think's relevant to the background?
I think it's always worth just re-highlighting, as David and Jen both have done, and you did in your intro, the number of different players who interface and the complexity there. As somebody who lives and breathes this is difficult to wrap your head around, let alone if it's something that you only touch in passing. So I think that's, it's already been raised, but I think it's worth raising again. But they've done an excellent job so far.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. So as you'll notice, Laurie's very interested in tackling the disclosure program issue, and that was the next thing that I wanted to have the panel comment on. It is recognized, for example, by ETSI as one of the pillars of IoT security enhancement. There's a lot of information about how to do it, easily available. Jeff Day earlier today talked about the Security Foundation's updated guide. But why is it that it's actually difficult? So I'd like to ask the panel about their experience with disclosure programs and what barriers that they see and have encountered. And I think the best person to start with here is Laurie, who's working for the world's most popular security disclosure platform. Laurie.
Thank you. Yes, I'm not sure how you measure popularity, you're right there. But we have, I've got some stats, of course. We've fixed 226,432 vulnerabilities across all of our hosted vulnerability disclosure programs here over the past a few days. And that translates to about 11 high or critical vulnerabilities every day at the moment. It's our run rate. I think, as I was saying before, like when I speak to companies, we're already kind of at the stage where they decided they want to have some form of vulnerability disclosure or CVD or bug bounty program. And so our job really is to try to help them understand how to implement it and what the pros and cons are of different approaches. And often one of the big barriers here is not necessarily the security or technology department. So for example, one of the first questions we ask them is, well, have you spoken to your communications team, your marketing team? Because often they're a team that, if you're doing something public and you're engaging with the public, then you need to somehow communicate this. And they're perhaps one of the worst teams that are able to do this, that this is the team that, comes up with the unhackable claims and doesn't want to admit that there are problems with their products, even though there probably are. And the second community that we really try to engage with proactively is the legal team. And the legal team, want to do is they want to send out an NDA or they want to have some form of intellectual property over the reports that someone else has written and is submitted to them out of the kindness of their hearts. And so we have to do a lot of education into like how in things like intellectual property, how things like signing an NDA after the research has been done, is not necessarily the nicest thing to do to someone that's reaching out to you. And then we also, in the case of when people want to reward people, we have to deal with finance teams who quite rightly might question, why are we sending £500 to this gentleman in Indonesia? And what's it for? And how does this all work? Is this the right market rate, etc. And often it's at those stages that the projects will get blocked, right? So often dealing with those teams up front is kind of what we do in order to make these things successful in the long run. And it's a big challenge even for technology teams. The 2021 MITRE Most Important Hardware CWEs was released last week. And number 6 is firmware not updatable, right? Which is, we all know it shouldn't be allowed, right? You should be able to update your firmware after it's been deployed. And so I still feel like there's a lot more work to do. However, we've still launched over 2,000 vulnerability disclosure programs. We've still got thousands of vulnerabilities being submitted every day. So from my perspective, I see the challenge, but I kind of guess what I'm trying to say is I'm up for it. We're quite happy to meet this one head on. Right.
That's very interesting, and an interesting perspective on the, shall we say, the corporate politics that get involved. On this topic of vulnerability disclosure programs, I'd like to ask James to give us some of his experience in running the CVD that the GSMA is running, which is, I guess, probably as complex as anyone's.
Sure. So to give us a short introduction to what we do. So obviously, GSMA is a mobile phone industry trade body of operators, vendors, other associated companies. So the vulnerabilities that we deal in are very much mobile focused, and obviously with mobile IoT, that's as a good overlap there. And why is CVD difficult, I think, is kind of what you said at the start. And I was sort of thinking through some of the problems that we've seen just in the last sort of year or so. And as Laurie says, there are a lot of competing stakeholders, and that's, if you're only dealing with one organization, then that's fine. But dealing across an industry where you've got suppliers, competitors, customers, suppliers of suppliers of suppliers, all of whom maybe don't have entirely aligned expectations of what something looks like, a good result looks like in this area, or the timeline required. That can all introduce that friction there, which isn't necessarily what the person who's submitted the research or the vulnerability to you thinks about. So that's definitely the role of somebody like me as a coordinator, or in a similar position within an organization, to act as that interface, because it really is a different world that we operate in as an organization dealing with this versus maybe not every single person who discloses, but a lot of people who will disclose. They come from a particular background, they've got a particular cultural practice, and I think David touched on that already. Potentially, sorry, maybe it was Jen. Often they've got a particular perspective on what the outcome should look like, and that is really valuable to understand, and obviously is part of the coordination process. But that may not be feasible within the timeline between when they want to make their vulnerability known publicly. They may want to get to Black Hat, and that's got a very hard deadline, and it just may not be feasible to deal with that. So a lot of expectation management, again, is there, I think, and that can be difficult, particularly when even before COVID, you won't have a face-to-face discussion most of the time. And obviously Laurie's platform tries to facilitate that on other organizations such as MITRE, or whoever's involved, try to do that. So complexity, lack of responsibility, or shared responsibility, or ambiguity in responsibility, and cultural differences, I'd say they're my top 3 difficulties from experience. They're by no means insurmountable, but particularly when it's a new process, it does require a lot of discussion up front if possible. But as you say, Laurie, you don't want to get 80% of the way there and not get the final 20. So fighting for the win, I think, is always got to be front of your mind, particularly when it's easy to lose sight of the reasons why we're doing this in the first place, which is to protect consumers and our networks or our products or our reputation, if that's what the marketing department wants us to protect.
Our digital civilization, we're calling it.
Yeah, go there. Yeah, that sounds great.
So, David, do you have anything to add about disclosures and protecting our digital civilization?
Well, it's anything but civilized in the digital world, in the metaverse, right? But I think realistically, my concern is about having worked with James and all of you here actually, that we're not the pace of adoption and the pace of sort of conversion for these companies to realize that they should be doing this and it's good practice and that they should liaise with security researchers is really slow. And we'll give you a sort of little pre-see on the report that the IoT Security Foundation will launch tomorrow, which is a series of reports that we do annually, where we look at the major manufacturers of IoT products that are sold across the world. And we just go and do that sort of the insecurity canary test by going and having a look to see whether they have a public point of security issue disclosure. It's quite easy, anybody can do it. And what we found year on year is it's steadily increasing. It was extremely poor, and now I would say it's just slightly less extremely poor. It is kind of leveled off this year. So we're still around about the point, just slightly over, where 1 in 5 companies in the world, IoT companies, have a way for security researchers to contact them. And that is just painfully bad. And what's worrying for those companies, doesn't worry me, what's worrying for those companies is that there's legislation coming in, as you've seen from Kat's presentation. Legislation is in place in the US for government purchasing. There's legislation coming in the UK and other places that will mandate this. So, but if you step back from this and go, that's just like the first thing, right, that I look at, that's the tip of the iceberg. So what the hell are these companies doing in their product development? And that is deeply concerning because, here we are, we were talking about this 5 years ago. Here we are now. Those companies could have transformed themselves and they could have done something about this. And yet we're talking nearly 4 in 5 companies are doing very little. And that should be a wake-up call for governments that, first of all, they're doing the right thing, that by regulating the market, because the market's clearly demonstrating massive failure. But secondly, that they've got to enforce this. They've got to stop these products being produced and being sold. And I think that's going to be the next big challenge for all of us, because really it's a kind of ticking bomb. We've dodged some bullets, we've been hit by a few, but that we've seen, Jen's an expert in ransomware. There can be some really, really, really harmful effects in the future. And we've got to deal with this now, not in another 5 years' time.
So you covered some interesting points there beyond the vulnerability disclosure, David, and I'd like to come back to some of those. But before I do, Jen, do you have anything to add to what's been said about the vulnerability disclosure situation?
I do, and I just want to ask David a question really quickly, sorry. But the data that you shared, do you cut it based at all? Do you look at it based on size of organization?
We can cut it that way. We haven't, because a lot of that information is quite difficult to get access to.
Sure,
so
yeah.
the way that we approach it is if a security researcher wanted to go to that company, what would be the first thing that they would do?
Sure.
And so we approach it from how difficult it is for the hacking community to basically get access to those companies.
Just because, my guess is that at the upper end of the market, you probably see a lot more adoption, right? We saw way back in, I want to say 2015, when the US Copyright Office introduced an exemption for security research into the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. We saw a lot of companies at that time that were making IoT go, oh, okay, we're going to get a lot of disclosures in a year when this comes into effect. And so we really need to like, do something about this.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden they started rolling out disclosure processes and building out VDPs, vulnerability disclosure programs. And so what I think we've seen is that there is a really long tail of smaller organizations and also organizations in different regions that haven't yet got there. And companies like Laurie's are helping them get there and are helping to push into those sectors and build awareness. But we still have a real lack of awareness. And the problem is customers aren't voting with their money, right? Like that reality is again, customers think if it's available, it's secure. So they're not choosing based on security. And it's hard to know whether they would choose based on security anyway if they knew the realities of the situation. How do you weigh up security versus shiny? And it does this thing. One person's vulnerability is another person's API, and I think the great capabilities that come with that.
I do encourage people to have a look at the report, and number 7 will really surprise you. But the companies in there, it doesn't demonstrate what people think. So there are some sectors that are doing particularly well, and we highlight the sort of that breakdown. But there are some major companies that don't even meet the basic threshold. So we kind of do this sort of ranking system based on what we expect regulators to ask for example. So we've got some that are super, super good, and there are some big companies in there. But there's some very big companies that have massive volume of IoT products in the market that are very well respected companies that people love because they've got particularly shiny products, maybe very expensive ones, and they are really not meeting the expectations of the market and their responsibilities, really.
Right, and we need to see regulators step up. I know we need to move on, so I'll wrap up by saying that I think Laurie and James both made the point that this is a cross-functional effort. You have to work across the organization and understand all those different parts. And I will just say, to me, we have to stop treating security as if it's other. Security needs to not be considered niche. It needs to not be considered separate. Security needs to be embedded into every other conversation. And until we figure out how to do that, and we start building empathy with other parts of the organization, and we start as security professionals educating them. You can't in your organization look at your legal team or your comms people. And I am, by the way, a reformed and recovering comms person who used to be like, kill it with fire, make it go away, no reputational impact. Until we start helping educate people like me on why this stuff matters and why it is a responsibility to protect the customer, they're never going to get it, because it's just not where they come from. It's not their background. It's not their world. Their view of protecting the customer is like, let's not freak the customer out. Let's not scare them. And so you have to take the role of being an advocate for this. You have to evangelize on it. And I know those are horrible, scary words to security professionals, but I really do think that we need to step up to the plate and start doing that stuff.
Right. Very, very interesting. And I think one of the things that's come through are the difficulties of doing things within the organizations not realizing they need to do things. And this kind of prompts the question, are companies actually ready for the regulation that's going to be hitting them? Without worrying about the details of the regulations that are coming out, they are coming down the line. They're going to be required. There are things like the US requirement for software bill of materials for federal entities. Do we think that organizations understand the consequences of regulation and the fact it's happening? I'll start with David, because you said a few things about this, and also you're very familiar with what's in the regulations.
Well, maybe not as familiar as I should be, but look, I think governments around the world have responded really, really well. There's massive defragmentation in the terms of expectations of what baseline requirements look like, and there's been a lot of collaborative effort across countries and regions across the world. Is absolutely amazing. So, and also I should add that the industry's involved in that. And just yesterday I downloaded a white paper that was sent, just a marketing thing about upcoming regulation and why you should be bothered. And lo and behold, there it was. This company, the chipset provider, had basically said, "Here's how our products meet the ETSI EN 303645 and the NIST spec." And I thought, that's great. That's exactly the market's driving this now, and certainly from the lowest level. So all of those companies that want to put those chips on their devices, they know where to go to buy these things, and that's really what we wanted. So I think there will be obviously this sort of like time lag, but what we have seen is, for example, certain big companies doing their own compliance schemes that already meet those requirements, and then add in a few other things for their requirements as well. And so I think you guys know that we have this mapping site that we sort of try to understand the landscape, and what we've done is, because of the defragmentation, and we're looking at maybe 2 or 3 real forerunners in terms of baseline requirements now, we've sort of reoriented that website to focus on the ETSI EN, and we're starting to see that move into the compliance space now. And actually Art Mannion, who some of you know, tweeted me this afternoon, and he has concerns that the next step is more complicated. And so what we mean by that is that sort of when you get down to the nitty gritty of what the regulator actually wants, does it become super complicated for the testing companies when you say, but I need the user to have a PIN for their child lock because it needs to be basic, and you've just banned that, and I need it, and those sorts of conversations. And I think I agree to a certain extent, but that shouldn't detract us from getting rid of all of these crappy default passwords. That's the main mission. There will be edge cases, and there will be blood spill, right? But I think it's worth it, because it's the vast majority of things that we need to hit. And of course, we'll come through, we'll improve things, we'll do sector specific things. There's for example, the lock sector are doing some interesting thing in ETSI. It'll evolve. But for the moment, I think the regulators are on the right path. We just need to make sure that the enforcement is strong. And in the UK, we have this thing called trading standards, and I don't think traditionally, that's been that strong. And maybe that kind of thing needs beefing up a little bit around the world, and we need to say enough's enough.
And thank you, David. James, you have a view of the industry from the GSMA. Do you think the parts of industry you see are ready for regulation?
We have a similar view as what David's mentioned about the report that's coming out tomorrow. I've not seen the report, so I don't know that who's named and shamed, but definitely providers who are larger, and by and large larger, companies tend to be the ones who are more security focused, and so are pretty much ready. The view of embedding stuff up and down the supply chain is one way of doing that. Showing, I think one of the comments somebody said is, rather than using the wrong language, maybe saying it enhances the customer experience. Maybe that's one way of looking at it. But ultimately, if there is some regulation coming, then it's going to have to be dealt with. And I don't think we're not tackling an original problem here. Let's look at energy efficiency in consumer products. It's similar. It's not the same. Years ago, nobody cared about it, and now everybody cares about it. Technology has improved. You've got a label, you've got a regulation. Companies have adapted to it. It's whether they adapt quick enough that there's enforcement action required. And I'm not suggesting that we need enforcement action. Hopefully, where security practices are seen as great and advertised as such, that will then encourage others to follow. And there's GSMA has recommendations in the mobile IoT security space around that. But obviously, regulation is a difficult one to talk about, because everybody has their own view of it. And as an organisation that represents or tries to represent lots of different players in the marketplace, I don't think we can say we're pro or anti any particular regulation. But it's coming down the line. So if people aren't ready, then they should be, which is basically what everyone's just said. But yeah.
Right. So, Laurie, you're seeing clients who know that they have to do something with vulnerability disclosure. Do you get a feeling from them that they're ready for the rest of the regulations that are coming?
We have quite a unique view from HackerOne perspective, because one of the key things that we do are what we call a public bug bounty program, where if anybody on the internet submits a vulnerability that's valid, then you'd get paid a reward, the bounty, which could be, the average bounty is about the cost of a secondhand kind of voxel Astra. You know, we're not talking huge amounts normally. And the number one reason for not running a public bug bounty program, which you'd imagine I hear a lot, is that number one, we're terrified that if we were to do this, that all of the products that we have will just get taken down, right? So there's not great confidence in their stability, number one. And then number two, even if there is confidence in the stability, that there's probably so many bugs out there that we either don't have the budget or the engineering capacity to fix them all. And so this is the thing that terrifies me, is that, you know, that people know that if they were to fully embrace this model, that this would they would not be ready, right? And so the question I always ask is, like, how can we get you ready, right? And a vulnerability disclosure program is a great way to get started. There are other ways too. And of course, it should all feed into, like what Dave was saying earlier, which is that we should have secure design. We should start having this feedback loop, right? Where we, perhaps not even just from one organization, but from an industry, we should feedback all of the vulnerabilities together and work out how to build secure products for the future. So I guess my answer is I don't think many people are ready.
Right. Well, Jen, do you have a view on that? What I would say is, if you could also make maybe a closing remark as well, because we're just about to run out of time on this panel.
Yeah, I mean, it's straightforward. If everybody was ready, we wouldn't need regulation. Very obvious.
Yeah, what
Yep.
she said.
So get ready, because it's coming, and it's coming in a lot of different jurisdictions, so get ready. That's my closing statement, is go and look at Cats Talk again, understand what's coming, get ready for it.
Right. Well, with that, I think that really quite summarizes everything that's been said about this very complex situation that we're in, and our endeavor to improve security. So I'd like to thank the panel members for the excellent contributions they've made.